Hello everyone, and welcome back to Afrodo Reviews, where on this channel, I help you decide. Does that book... You're interrupting my flow. Is that book worth reading over second breakfast? Or does it deserve the fiery pits of Mount Doom? So let's decide. Yeah, I didn't drag Mount Doom out here again. It's not holding together very well. It's an old cardboard box that I've been using for like a year and a half now. So, yeah, it's not holding together very well. You guys also might want to. I'm also gonna apologize right off the bat. This review is a little late, mostly because I was very tired yesterday and I did not have the energy to actually record this and then edit it and everything. So I apologize on that front. But anyways, that being said, let's go on. Today's book is Dark Souls, Masque of Vindication. Published on October 22nd of 2022. This was written by Michael A. Stackpole, a familiar name on this channel for anyone who's watched my Star Wars EU books. He's the familiar face that wrote much of X-Wing Rogue Squadron. I also believe he had a hand in... He wrote one of the other expanded universe novels I own beyond Dark Souls, but that's another day. I'll talk about that another day. The book itself doesn't have much to speak of, though, beyond this interesting little tidbit, at least in terms of trivia. Coming out well after the most recent of the entry in the Dark Souls universe, it has a tenuous connection with any of the games at best. But let's not be getting into that just yet. For now, here's the report card. And now let's move on to the cover. What is there to say about the cover? Well, I don't have any idea what to do, but I did bring on someone who has a lot more experience than me in this franchise. Which is saying something, because I've played pretty much every Soulsborne game out there. You know, Dark Souls 1, Dark Souls 2, although I didn't beat Dark Souls 2 to be fair. Dark Souls 3, Bloodborne, Elden Ring, I even did Sekiro, but like Dark Souls 2, I didn't really finish that. It's a completely different speed for me in terms of how to actually fight, so I kind of gave up. But anyways, instead I brought in my very own family. My nephew, Gabriel. He's a massive fan of the Soulsborne series, as in trying to complete every game at Soul Level 1, big fan. And he seemed a perfect fit to discuss this book with me. So he's going to give you a rundown on the world of the Dark Souls, and then take you through his thoughts on the cover. Take it away.
Imagine a world cloaked in perpetual twilight, where ancient ruins echo with the whispers of forgotten legends, and the air is heavy with the scent of decay. This is the realm of Dark Souls. A place where time is as twisted as the gnarled trees that dot its landscape. The skies above is a canvas of shifting hues, sometimes bathed in an eerie crimson glow, other times veiled in impenetrable darkness. The land itself seems to breathe, heaving with the weight of ancient curses and forgotten sins. This world is not for the faint of heart. It is a place where every step may lead to certain death, where monstrous creatures lurk in the shadows, and the very ground beneath your feet is fraught with danger. This cover portrays our main character clad in metal armor, standing over what many say is the essence of Dark Souls, a bonfire with a twisted sword embedded into it. This cover is very dark, which in my opinion works in its favor, as it portrays the very world of Dark Souls. You are fated to be shrouded in darkness throughout your journey, with only the few bonfires around the world being your light at the end of the tunnel. In a land plagued by darkness and decay, an unarmed undead rises in an ancient crypt, embarking on a journey driven by an unknown force. The once shining kingdom is now fractured, overrun by mindless hollows. To restore the kingdom, the undead must aid Balerion, the son of the old king, in freeing his father. Joined by surviving champions from an earlier era, they face daunting challenges and enemies, yet their greatest obstacle, the uncertainty of whether their troubled world can truly be redeemed, or is it destined to vanish into darkness.
So, he pretty much gave you an amazing rundown on everything that is needed. So let's go ahead and just get into this review. I mean, after all, I don't really have much to disagree with him on the Dark Souls cover, nor do I have anything to add in terms of his world description. So, now, unlike my normal collaborations, I'm going to intersperse my thoughts and my nephew's thoughts throughout the review section. Just so you're forewarned. First, we're going to do my nephew's thoughts, at least in part, and then my own. And I'm going to try to talk about these sections of the book in tandem with him.
I found this novel to be a captivating experience due to its unique approach of not directly retelling the Dark Souls games, but rather incorporating familiar elements like the undead, bonfires, and Estus flasks into a fresh narrative. This approach allowed the story to stand on its own while still invoking the essence of the Souls series, characterized by a world shrouded in darkness, decay, and mysterious powers. The engaging narrative of the novel kept me hooked with its protagonist's repeated deaths in treacherous dungeons, echoing the challenging gameplay and themes of perseverance found in Dark Souls. Plus, the integration of Souls mechanics, such as the undead regaining prior knowledge and power from absorbed souls, added depth and intrigue to the storytelling, making it easy to immerse myself in the protagonist's quest driven by an unknown purpose.
For the most part, I agree with him. As far as the novel goes, it's a rather decent read. At least at first. The first third of the novel and then portions of the second are pretty fun to read, and they're fairly engaging. It holds your attention nice, and as Michael Stackpole is a very experienced writer who has a lot of famous books under his belt, you can obviously tell the person writing this is a competent writer. Like I mentioned, it does separate itself from the already established stories of the 3 games in the Dark Souls world, choosing instead to merely incorporate elements of the franchise to tell its own story. This allows it to be its own unique tale without needing extreme familiarity with the game. There are definitely elements of this book and its world building that do suffer from this approach a little bit, don't get me wrong, but for the most part, the book really does well to use this. At least at first. I think the longer the story went on, the less relevant these connections became. With such a heavy focus on the mechanics of the game being told in a satisfying way to the uninitiated, the fact that the latter half of the story, these mechanics almost vanish, and it's very notable. I don't think that Theranos or Crotha, the 2 resident undead within this tale, used their Estus flasks at all in at least the last 100 pages of this book. And the last time I recall either of them resurrecting at a bonfire was near page 140, which is a little under halfway through the book. In fact, apart from the occasional mention, oh, we ran into a bonfire, the bonfire has basically ceased to matter at this point. Which, as my nephew mentioned in his review of the cover, one could argue the bonfires are the very soul of this franchise. But that's theory crafting territory. If I can ever convince him to do his own channel, you probably hear more about that. But actually, for the most part, after chapter 15, the story seems to approach this purely from a dark fantasy style rather than a Dark Souls setting. Our characters go from what feels like, an actual Dark Souls game to a dark fantasy political journey, as they hardly raise their weapons to fight tough foes after a certain point. Which is mostly an issue because one of the Dark Souls' greatest appeals as a game is the creative boss designs and amazingly balanced mechanics. So part of me was really hoping to see what they could do with that in a novel form where the restrictions of gameplay isn't necessarily an issue. They don't have to, find a way to use a boss mechanics into a different design or anything like that. They can just make their own. And again, like the first third of the story and then parts of the second do utilize this. We do see what would be bosses in other worlds, but then after a certain point, it's sort of like...
However, despite these strengths, there are definitely some areas for improvement. The depiction of the 3 lands, while intriguing, lacked the deeper meaning and immersion one would expect. Specifically, the land of the princess. It felt superficial in its portrayal of complete perfection, and like the other kingdoms, it failed to provide the depth needed to fully engage me as a reader.
I do also have to agree with my nephew on this section as well, though to a little more of a varying degree. While I do think that the princess's land, Trefrum, I think I'm saying that right, is a very superficial in its depiction of absolute perfection, I do think that's sort of the idea Stackpole was going for. That absolute perfection itself is a superficial concept that cannot be conceivably attained, because people's idea on what is perfection will always be different. Although I do admit that this is also challenged a little, at least my perception on this, is challenged a little when one of our characters, a knight of beauty named Sarissa, I believe it's called Sarissa, meets her ultimate fate. Honestly, that whole section was a bit weird. She was introduced as someone who should have an easy time living in Treferum, whatever. A woman whose beauty is so great that the princess forced her to cut a scar into her face when she was younger, so that she would have a blemish that would detract from it and make the princess the prettier one. However, through much of her exposure in the story, Sarissa seems to take the stance that beauty is not something that is without, but within, and that one's true beauty must lie far more in someone's actions than their physical appearance. She very much is embodying this Confucius quote. In a land where physical beauty has become so prevalent, she's a woman who's fighting for the inner beauty of the world. Except when she finally meets children that are prettier than her, her mind literally snaps and she goes into a catatonic state because she cannot handle that she's the most beautiful thing in the world.
Wait, what?
And while I was expecting Sarissa to eventually be written out in some way, as Stackpole was sort of falling into the habit of introduce a disposable NPC for this new land so they can be killed off to show the danger, I think the getting rid of her goes pretty heavy in contrast to what she had been set up to stand for throughout most of this book. Never mind the idea that one of the heroes literally dying in the same way that the main villain of this land would have died in the exact same scenario is very ridiculous. I get what Stackpole was going for, especially with a lot of these, with a lot of the Knights of Virtue as champions past. One of the things is that they're supposed to embody a virtue. Crotha embodies truth. Sarissa embodies beauty. Another character like Phisalandra embodies fidelity. And then you have another character who embodies victory. And they're all supposed to embody these virtues, but in reality, they're just as consumed by the vice that directly contrasts it. You know, the idea is that Sarissa believes in beauty, inner beauty, and everything like that, but is so vain that the idea of finding someone who's prettier than her, or basically finding children who are prettier than her, literally shakes her worldview so much she snaps, frosts at the mouth, and then just dies on the floor. Which, again, doesn't make sense, because up until that point she was very much a beauty is not skin deep, it's about who you are as a person. But these oddities and characters lie with a lot of them. Apart from Crotha, most of Theranos' companions are fairly one-dimensional. Balaran, who is supposed to be a key figure in this, is a destined child, a perfect ruler of the land. If it wasn't done on purpose, he would be a very egregious Mary Sue character, who's a great leader, near masters everything he tries, and is a truly kind-hearted individual. And while he is still a Mary Sue, even though with it being intentional, it's more to serve a purpose. Then there's Philisania, a knight of fidelity, who for the most part serves as what appears to be a loyal lover of Balaran, and little else for much of the book. Until out of nowhere in the final act, she's revealed as a traitor for Balaran's eldest half-brother, who is actually playing the long game and manipulating Balaran for her own means. Which ties back to my earlier point at the Knights of Virtue. She's a knight of fidelity, but in reality, her true loyalty lies only within herself. Therefore, although she tries to embody the virtue of fidelity, her vice is selfishness. Except that there was so little build-up and characterization hinting at this that it really bothered me when it was revealed. But when I say that there's like no build-up to it, there's like no way that they show it, because it's literally a last-minute twist. It's basically the equivalent of Prince Hans in Frozen. You know, they suddenly needed a twist and decided, let's do a character that has in no way been built up like this. That'll be shocking. Like, they could have perhaps shown that she consistently tries to pull Balaran out of conflicts, while insisting that she remains by his side as a guard, so you can come back to it later and realize it was both a ploy to manipulate Balaran more, while also protecting herself from conflict, because neither her nor Balaran are undead who will come back after death. Or have a scene where Theranos notes that she failed to act at a time she should have, and wonders why. Like, maybe there's a point where Balaran almost dies, but the only way Philisania would have been able to intervene is she herself gets hurt. Something a little bit like that. Mild hints. Anything would have been nice rather than the nothing we got. But overall, that's just kind of an issue with the latter half of the book.
Additionally, the novel's abrupt ending left me wanting more closure and a more decisive resolution. While the vague endings typical of Souls stories can add to the mysterious atmosphere, in this case, it detracts from the overall satisfaction with the narrative. Furthermore, the inclusion of temporal anomalies and unexplained elements, such as the Estus and bonfires, while it may enhance the atmosphere reminiscent of Dark Souls, you would already need knowledge about Dark Souls prior to reading to understand how or why these things even work. If you were without any prior knowledge, it would leave you wishing for more clarity or context regarding these elements to fully understand their significance in the story.
Now this is very true. I personally believe that Stackpole intended for this to be the first book of many. I don't make that assumption lightly, as this book honestly has the format of someone was initially under the impression that he would have at least 3-4 books to tell his tale before being suddenly told that wasn't the case. And he wasn't exactly given time to correct that assumption. The first half of the book is a slow, plodding narrative, clearly trying to emulate how many players approach the game. There's a lot of trial and error with Theranos, as he makes little bits of progress for each death and learning new things with each attempt. But then, somewhere after they met with Balaran, someone walked in and is like, oh, no, you're only getting 1 book. And no, you're not getting extra time to, fix all the issues. Because he's on a deadline. So while the first half of the book has a slow, careful, almost cautious pace that directly mirrors how a player begins every Soulsborne game, the second half suddenly has a much faster, less cautious, devil-may-care attitude towards the world. Perhaps unintentionally mirroring a veteran player on New Game++++, trying to get a speed run while wearing no armor.
Oh, jeez. It's 2-on-1, pal. Give it up.
And like my nephew said, that's very evident from the second land Treffer. Whereas the land before was something fitting of a Souls game quest, what with our heroes diving into a ring city spackled with gold to recover a specific item, all while a time warp lays over it, muting time in that area, only to be met with a boss creature at the very end made of living gold with unique mechanics as it seems to melt and then change shapes back into a solid piece and takes the gold from around it the more it gets hurt. A very interesting idea. The second just has our characters traveling into the city, occasionally stabbing a band of slavers that come near them, before getting to another city, picking up a child's doll, and returning. With that, they move on. Honestly, at one point, I began to wonder if this book was supposed to be foreshadowing a next entry in the series. As, although Miyazaki did say he considered Dark Souls 3 the definitive end of the franchise, he also said that he wouldn't stand in the way if someone else wanted to make more in the series. But I realized that couldn't be the case, especially near the end, where our characters kill the leader of the last realm, Dollarod, and then, the final twist at the end. As both of those characters at the very end would have been amazing final boss fights, especially with Dollarod coming off more like a Rohadan from Elden Ring. Not to mention, this book also feels a bit like it's going against the Dark Souls theming. Whereas 3, and to a somewhat subtler intent, the first game, have strong themes that a current age must come to an end for a new age to begin, this book almost takes a stance that allowing such a thing, if you can stop it, is bad. The main villain of the book is someone who allowed this cycle to occur when he could have forestalled it. And while emphasis is placed on his willingness to let this happen being more for selfish intentions than altruistic intentions, like, opposing Gale, the slave knight, versus, Gwyn, if he had let the world ended, ended. Let the world ended. Yeah, no, I know what I said, guys. You don't have to comment. It does still somewhat go against the message. It would have been more interesting to see Balaram's attempts to bring this nation back together while ultimately good intention were making things worse. And that maybe if letting this land burn and become its own thing to make a new thing from the ashes was better. Overall, I would give this book a firm 5 out of 10. The book itself is fine at first. The first 100 or so pages held my attention pretty well, but you'll find it doesn't reward you much for sticking around. As mentioned by my nephew, the experience isn't very rewarding, and the ending that this book has is so abrupt and lacking in satisfaction. Overall, it's not an experience that was ultimately rewarding past a certain point, and due to it mostly using the mechanics of Dark Souls and not necessarily Miyazaki's world, I can't recommend it based on the enjoyment of the games. There's also issues where if you haven't played the games, like my nephew said, you won't understand certain things about it. Because it doesn't explain the Estus flask, it doesn't explain how the bonfires work, it doesn't explain what creates the undead, really. It just says undead exist, which is fine enough. But our character, who's supposed to be a scholar, doesn't question it. And it also doesn't explain how why the time warps are happening. Like at one point, our characters in that ring city are gone for 5 years when it doesn't feel like they've been gone that long. Like I said, in the end, it's more of a dark fantasy novel using the same mechanics of the world, if not necessarily the same setting. So when it comes to the question of whether or not it deserves Mount Doom, the answer is yeah, kinda. I mean, I don't really want to put it into Mount Doom, as the first 100 or so pages are definitely a good read for me. And I honestly believe Stackpole had intentions to do something else than he ended up doing with this book. But I can't say that for sure. As far as I know, Stackpole could have just been like, I don't care anymore, after a certain point, and just wrote out a book to meet a deadline. But with its terrible ending and increasingly rushed and unsatisfying storytelling near the end, I just don't think the payoff of reading this book is worth the hours it will take to read it. So therefore, I can't really recommend it to anyone. I don't recommend reading it. And so, Mount Doom. Seriously though, guys, you have no idea how bad that ending was. It was just so bad. It's an unsatisfying ending. Almost like The Sopranos, where they just cut off mid-sentence.